I spent a long time in my undergraduate days really trying to challenge the resurrection as a historical event, and came away absolutely convinced that this was a fact of history on which I could base my life. One thing that's repeated in the Gospels, frequently repeated, is the detail of Christ's trial. And I've often wondered in those days, why so much detail? Until I realized that he was put on trial for being a terrorist in modern terms. And so seriously did the Roman authorities take his claim to be king that the Roman procurator, Pilate, decided to do the investigation himself. That was a most unusual procedure. And when he talked to Christ, "Are you a king then?" In other words, are you a political enemy or threat to my rule and the rule of Rome? He said, "Well, you said it, I am a king, but not in the sense you mean it." And then he explained, he said, "To this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth." And Pilate, listening to this, realized something. He was pretty sharp. He immediately saw that Christ was innocent. If he professes to be king of the truth, Pilate knew, as well as most of us will know when we think about it, that the one thing you cannot impose by violence is truth. So Pilate goes out and says he was innocent. But Jesus explained the nature of his government. Why was he not a political threat? He said, "If I were your sort of king, my servants would have been fighting so that I should not be delivered to you." But they weren't fighting. My kingdom is not now from here. And that was so important to me, coming up to Cambridge, realizing that the stance of many of my fellow countrymen, both Protestant and Catholic, was not Christian at all. Because to take up weapons like AK-47s and bombs to protect or advance Christ's message is not being Christian, it's being anti-Christian. And I remember explaining this to Christopher Hitchens years later, who was vehement about the wars caused by Christianity. And I said, "Christopher, you clearly haven't spent any time in the company of Jesus Christ, because he would have stood on your side in this." He repudiated it all. So those were very big lessons coming up here. And the truth, that truth question, has lived with me all my life to now. I was interested in truth, cost what it may actually, because my parents lived and they discovered truth in the Bible, and that's where I discovered it as well.
Now, I want to stick on Cambridge because we're here.
Yes.
So you've made this transition from, frankly, quite a rural part of Northern Ireland. The boy arrives at an elite university. He's met off the station by a farmer who takes him to church the next day, and then he's into this elite university. How did you find your time in Cambridge impacted your thinking and your faith?
But you've missed something, Richard.
I normally do. That's
On
why
day 2 in Cambridge, that farmer who became a great friend took me to church. And there were 4 girls sitting there, 4, 3, 2, 1. And they were glorious, especially the eldest of them. And I've been married to her now for 56 years. So that was day 2. Day 3, I was inducted into the college just across the road, Emmanuel College, where I stayed for 7 years. It was, of course, very daunting. I never thought I'd get into the university here, because in those days they didn't recognize the A-levels I'd done, and they had this ferocious institution where if you wanted to get into Cambridge, you had to come here for a week and do some absolutely grueling examinations. And I would hear people muttering as they came out, "I got 5 questions done," all this kind of stuff. And I'd managed to attempt 2 and all this kind of thing. And I thought, that's the end of it. I've had a week in Cambridge, I'll never be here again. So it was quite a surprise to find that I'd got in. I got in indeed with some money, £40 a year. That was really big stuff in those days. So All these questions were whirling around. And now here I was in this wonderful city, able to ask people about them. And I deliberately started week 1, day 3. I started asking people, seeking them out actually, in my own college who didn't share my worldview. Because I found, first of all, it's much easier to ask questions than answer them. And secondly, that you really get to know people by asking them questions. Asking them what makes them tick, what they regard as important, where their ethical principles come from, and so on. I must have been an absolute nuisance, you know. But somehow, I got talking to a lot of people, not only fellow students, but academics, but mainly my fellow students. And so I felt really what's behind this is what's written here. See, I believed that command of Christ himself, go into all the world. Well, here I was, and all the world was around me in Cambridge. And it is a powerful statement of what I believe is the fundamental Christian commitment to speak and nowadays write about my faith and argue it in the marketplace, in the public square of this world. So I did that. And what I discovered was people were really interested. Many people had never heard. And so it was information they needed. But people had all sorts of questions. And before long, I was utterly bombarded by questions.
Right.
And I loved
So you're
it.
going to be bombarded by another question.
Okay,
because,
right.
John's got a bad back at the moment, so we're very, very grateful that he's done tonight. And he said to me earlier, so I'm not sure I'm going to last 45 minutes. Well, you've just taken 20 minutes on the first 2 questions, so we could be here for a while. Now, I'd like to raise with you 2 public intellectuals, actually, because I want to go down this route of people who you've loved talking to and debating with, some you've met, some you haven't, but who've radically challenged the Christian position. I would like to start with Stephen Hawking. 2 quotes for you from Hawking. You don't need a God to create it. The universe is the ultimate free lunch. And my second quote, because there is such a law as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. What says John Lennox?
Well, he's puzzled. First of all, because I was shown a copy of his book before he published it. It's absolutely fascinating, this claim to be able to explain the universe and say that we don't need a God to create it. It's the ultimate free lunch. I couldn't help thinking at the time that no lunch is ever free. Somebody's got to cook it and prepare it and all the rest of it. They don't just pop into existence, free lunches. So what he kind of meant is not entirely clear to me. Something we're given as a given. Well, that would be true from my perspective. The universe is a given, but there is a giver. And he didn't answer the question. And I've met this many, many times from academics. With variations. Peter Singer was another person I debated, and he put it slightly differently. He said, we don't need a God to explain the universe. And it was statements like that, and that of Hawking, that led me to investigate, what do we mean by an explanation? And that's a very important thing, because there's a lot of thinking today that science explains everything. And, it's very funny when you investigate it. I often illustrate this. What does the law of gravity explain? I used to think it explained gravity, but it doesn't. Nobody really knows what gravity is. But what the law of gravity does is enable you to do calculations on massive bodies and how they behave in respect of each other. But it doesn't tell you what gravity is. And Newton realized that. So that even a so-called scientific explanation is very rarely complete. Now, let's take Hawking, because Hawking was a genius, an absolute genius. I can remember him well in the days before his disease began to strike him. He's just a bit ahead of me in Cambridge, and light years ahead of me in his brain power. Stephen Hawking was absolutely brilliant at astrophysics. But as often happens, People wander outside their field. And there's a lovely quote by Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Richard Feynman said, outside their own field of expertise, the scientist is just as dumb as anybody else. Now, I need to take that on board myself, because I'm talking outside my field. But you see, this statement, here's the explanation. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. When I first read that, I thought, come again? Because there is a law like gravity, that is, because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. That is a logical contradiction to start with. But it's worse. The universe will create itself. So he says. Well, if I say X creates Y, roughly you've got the idea if you've got X, you can produce Y. If I say X creates X itself, then I would want to say that nonsense remains nonsense even if a high-powered scientist says it. It is logically incoherent. But it's worse still than that. There's a third degree of difficulty here. Because there is a law like gravity. Now, of course, you've seen he's avoided the question, where do these laws come from? But you can't have laws without a universe that they describe. That's what laws are. But are laws creative? Think of Newton's laws of motion. I watched a bit of the Masters snooker and admired the genius of these people. And I think always of Newton's laws when I watch snooker. But Newton's law of motion never moved a snooker ball in the history of the universe. People with cues move the balls. The laws describe, they don't cause. So there's an absolutely fundamental philosophical mistake here. And I find myself agreeing. Hello, I'll say again, Hawking was brilliant mathematically. I agree with Lord Martin Rees, who said that I know Stephen Hawking well, and he knows nothing about theology and very little about philosophy, and I wouldn't listen to him on either subject. But you see, the problem is when a scientist of his capacity makes a statement, as he did in later life, that there was no God, it troubles people. Now, I wrote a little book called God and Stephen Hawking. Whose design is it anyway? And I want to tell you why I wrote the book. I got a letter from my home country from a young man who'd been driving past a petrol station, and there's a big newspaper hoarding. Hawking says there's no God. And he said, I was so distressed by this, I nearly crashed the car. And he wrote to me and he said, if Stephen Hawking says there's no God, who am I to say there is? And my heart went out to him. So I decided to write a book. And I noticed that none of Hawking's contemporaries or colleagues have ever made the slightest attempt to answer the issues I raised, including the one I've just been through. In other words, I try to take seriously claims like this to explain, and I discover they're empty. And not only empty, but meaningless.
Right, well, I'm going to hit you with another one.
Oh, are you? Right, okay.
So Stephen Weinberg, the Nobel laureate in physics, he said this, I do indeed think we are the winners in a cosmic lottery, to which you would say?
Well, what do you mean by that exactly? I presume he means that everything just happens by chance. But it's interesting that as died-hard an atheist as Dawkins is, whom I've debated several times, Dawkins doesn't believe it happened by chance because the chances are just far too small. So what Stephen Weinberg meant, I don't know. And I'm sorry I don't know, Richard, because not long before he died, there was a debate set up between me and Weinberg in Austin, Texas. And unfortunately, he withdrew from it. But it would have been interesting to find out. Again, it seems to me that this idea that it's all by chance is something that the human mind rebels against. Now, the interesting thing about physics that I've discovered and been very interested in is their observation of the fact that the universe is fine-tuned. Now, I have a colleague in Oxford who's a professor of philosophy and an atheist, and a lot of his students are atheists. And he invited me to talk to them about God. He said, they'll roast you, but we'll give you a good dinner afterwards. I said, okay. But he said, I hope when you come that you'll use the best argument against atheism. Now, this is an atheist professor at Oxford speaking. Well, I said, if you tell me what the best argument is, I'll use it. So he did, and I used it. He said, if I were ever to become a theist or give up my atheism, it would be because of the fine-tuning of the universe. The fact that the constants of nature are so accurately set that they make possible carbon-based life. He said that is, for me, one of the things that speaks, because this is at the heart of physics. There are relatively few people, hardly any these days, who would deny it. Hawking said it's there, and it demands an explanation. And there are two explanations offered. The one is what was believed by the person that taught me quantum mechanics, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, that it was God behind it. The other is that we live in an infinite ensemble of universes. It's the multiverse view, so that there must be a universe in which everything possible happens. And as Polkinghorne said, it's much more economical to believe in one universe behind which there is a God than in an infinite number of universes, none of which is accessible, and the evidence for them is practically zero. There is such a dominance of the worldview of naturalism in particularly the scientific establishment today. People don't get a chance of hearing arguments in the other direction, which is ironic. I am in the University of Oxford. What's its motto? Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my light. And the people that founded Cambridge and Oxford and so on, centuries ago, were people who unified all branches of thinking. And God was on the intellectual agenda just as much as physics and mathematics. And we've lost that because we haven't allowed, I'm afraid, in some cases, a proper discussion in the public space of the real evidence on both sides. And that's why I debated Dawkins, Singer, and all the rest of them.
Well, that's a good point, because you've had all of these debates. You say they're terrifying. As you've gone through this, with all of these public debates, have you ever felt concerned that science will actually end up burying your God? I know you've written a book on it, but tell us about why.
No, I've never felt that. And that I say that with some hesitation in the sense that it sounds arrogant. But I started, you see, let me put it another way. People often say to me, putting your question in different words, do you ever doubt? Now, doubt tends to have two meanings. And the most common meaning is that sinking feeling that everything's going black and there's no hope and so on, and you're in darkness and you'll never get out of it. That kind of depressive doubt. But there's another kind of doubt. You see, the word doubt in English comes from the Latin word dubitare, to be in two minds, essentially. Now, I have spent my life doubting my Christian faith in that second sense. I've never had the deep depressive feeling that it's all going to pieces. But the reason I'm sitting here talking to you tonight is because I have questioned and questioned and questioned and questioned. And I take the views of other people very seriously. It seems to me this is absolutely crucial for myself as a Christian to take the arguments of people that oppose Christianity seriously. Read their books. Just a little story. I first met Hitchens, and I said, "You're a contrarian, aren't you?" in the first 2 minutes. "You're a contrarian." "Oh," he said, "how do you know that?" I said, "I read your book." And he just stopped. He said, "You what?" I said, "You heard me. I read your book." He said, "Did you really read my book?" I said, "Yes." He was staggered that I would read his book, as if that wasn't the normal thing to do when you're debating someone. And I said, "I've got a question for you. I said, why do you get almost all your arguments from one source? He said, do I? I said, yes. What's the source? Tom Paine. He said, you're right. And immediately with a rapport, which was interesting, and you can see what happened if you watch the debate. But that kind of attitude of reading what other people think, I think what I've discovered is the answers come in the Christian faith. And when you take that whole general thing, the idea of scientism, now I'm not going to go into it, but that's the notion that science is the only way to truth. I'm very concerned about that because it's actually at its heart illogical, because the statement science is the only way to truth is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. But that's why I wrote this little book. If anybody here wants to know more about the kind of arguments that I've just briefly sketched tonight, this book is called Can Science Explain Everything? And it's available in many languages if you want to follow it any further. Christianity is not a religion in the usual sense of that word. I often ask people what they think a religion is, and the usual thing that comes out is it's a bit like a course at Cambridge. A degree course at Cambridge. You get in, there's some sort of ceremony of getting in, and then you work very hard, and you've got gurus and imams and priests and people to teach you, professors, and then you face judgment called finals. And I can see that some of you like the thought of that final judgment. It's fearsome, isn't it? I remember it well. And even if your professors are really kind people, like me, you see, even if they're really kind, they cannot guarantee that you're going to get through. Why? Because it's a merit-based system. It's based on your merit alone, your capability. So they cannot give you an assurance along the journey that you're going to get through. Now, most people, I find, will tell me, when I ask them, what's a religion? They'll say something like that. There's some sort of induction when you're a child, maybe, and then you're taught various rules and precepts, and you're taught to keep them. And if you keep them sufficiently well, when you reach a day of assessment or judgment or something like that, then you'll be accepted by God. Otherwise, you're in serious trouble. You see, many people think that Christianity is like that, but it isn't. And this is where I would like to make this so very clear. Christianity is not a merit-based system at all. You see, when I speak to you here, let me put it utterly bluntly, I am sure that God has accepted me. Now, if Christianity were merit-based, that would be utterly arrogant. What right have I to say that God has accepted me? The key to Christianity is what lies at its heart, and that is the cross, where Christ died and rose again. And that's part of the evidence that brings me right into the Christian orbit, because what Christ has done for me, I don't find anywhere else. You see, Jesus Christ does not compete with any other religion when he claims to be God incarnate, who died for us and rose again, because nobody else claims that. And that he has the authority to pronounce us accepted by God, not at the final judgment, but now. That is the dramatic difference. And that's why I'm a Christian. Because that is utterly unique. It means that I can live for him, not to gain acceptance, but because I've got it. Do you remember the girl I mentioned that I saw? You'd need to know how we got engaged, wouldn't you? And married. Well, I gave her a nice book. It was a cookery book. And I said to her, you know, Sally, I would very much like you to be my wife. Now, it's going to be like this. You know that I love Apfelstrudel. I really do like it. Now, if you keep the rules in this book, it's on page 63, by the way. If you keep the rules in this book for, let's be reasonable, say 40 years, I will accept you. Otherwise, you can go back to your mother. Now, you laugh. Why do you laugh? Because that's the way millions of people think of God. If I behave, you'll accept me. Millions of people in all kinds of religions, including professing Christians, think that way. But no, it didn't happen that way. I did give her a cookbook, but not in order to gain my acceptance, but because she had it. That's what sets people free to live within a marriage. They're not cooking to gain acceptance, are they? They're cooking to express their love. It's exactly the same with God. You wouldn't insult a fellow human being by telling them that their relationship depends on their performance. And that's why the Christian message, which is unique, as I say, it doesn't compete with anybody else, because no one else offers me that acceptance, not because of what I've done, but because I've accepted what Christ has done. Now, that is the answer to your question. I just see that this fits absolutely everything that makes sense to me, and therefore I have lived in that way for the last 70 years. There's a legacy that Christianity has left that we need to take seriously because it's there. It's not something that we fudged up. It is the fact. Here I am a scientist. Where did modern science spring from? Faith in God of Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, and all the rest of these pioneers. That isn't an accident. That is something that philosophers and historians of science had teased out and seen that there's a real connection between faith in God and the rise of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries. We live in a universe where it's very important to know what normally happens so that if God stages an unusual event, we will recognize it as such. No Christian, particularly not me, is claiming that Christ rose because of the laws of nature operating in the tomb 5 minutes before he rose. No. I'm claiming that God raised him from the dead. The God that created the whole show and set it to run normally on recognizable processes that we recognize as laws can feed a new event in. And because we know those laws, we recognize this as something, well, miraculous, yes, but that only means wonderful, as supernatural, that there's something beyond nature. And that's how, as a scientist, I find no difficulty in principle in believing in miracles. But now if you come to Jesus Christ, clearly what the early Christians preached, they went into all the world because they'd met him risen from the dead. That's where that text comes from in Matthew. How do we know he rose from the dead? Well, that is something where we need to use wider kinds of evidence. Science won't tell you either way, but we have to use two other things. And one is history and the other is human psychology. But to go into that in any detail, when I've done so in this little book and in many others, it's a hugely important question. But I wouldn't insult you by trying to compress it into just a few sentences. It seems to me, and I spent a long time in my undergraduate days really trying to challenge the resurrection as a historical event, and came away absolutely convinced that this was a fact of history on which I could base my life.
I've got one more quote for you. It's back with Richard Dawkins. He says that he accuses Christians of having a morbid interest in sin. Do they, John?
Yes, that's a quote from the God Delusion. It's sin, 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 sin. He repeats it half a dozen times. Well, some Christians, of course, do have a morbid interest in things like sin and other things because they may be depressed, they may have various chemical things wrong with their brains and so on. But to take it at face value, sin is a question at the heart of Christianity because it's what wrecks life. And when I first read that, I thought, but Richard, if you've got no solution to sin and no answer to the problem of human guilt, it is something that if you take it seriously, you will take a morbid interest in it. The wonderful thing about the Christian faith is that if we are prepared to respond to Christ and trust him and repent of our sin, in other words, turn away from it, we will receive peace with God and the guilt is lifted. That is a spectacular experience that I've seen happen with so many people. There is something. Sin is a very real thing and guilt is a very real thing, which is why so many people, young people I meet, are burdened with it and would love to have some sense of peace and identity. And that's what connects all the fields tonight. You see, I meet many people. I still talk to a lot of people. And the big issues these days I find are not so much God as creator, but they're where can I find meaning and identity? But they're connected, you see, because a person without a past has no identity. They've lost their identity. And the big thing in the past of this universe is that it was created by God, and you were created in God's image, which makes you of infinite value. That gives you value to start with. But then there's this big problem of human sin. And so therefore, I think that Christianity is right in calling attention to it, because all utopias up to now, people have tried to build them, bypassing the problem of human sin. And you see that within the Nazis, within the Russians, trying to make a perfect man and bypassing the question of guilt, bypassing moral questions. That's the one thing God did not do in Christ. The moral question is right at the heart of it. I'm going to keep this very brief. At the heart of Christianity is a cross. The claim is that the person on the cross is God incarnate. So we can ask the question logically, what is God doing on the cross? And it's pretty obvious when you think about it that it certainly means that God has not kept distant from our suffering, but has himself entered into it and become part of it. I find that very impressive. But it wouldn't give me a shred of hope if that's where it finished. In fact, if that's where it had finished, we'd never have heard of Jesus. But it's the fact he rose from the dead, broke the ultimate barrier that takes hope away, and that is death. That's where I believe there is real hope. We all see a mixed picture as we look at the universe. I call it bombs and beauty. Flowers, stars, barbed wire, and bombs. It's a mixture of good and evil. And all worldviews must face that fact that that's how it is. And in beginning to look at the life of Christ and his death and resurrection, we can see a way in. Because you see, there are two ways of looking at suffering. There's if you yourself are suffering, or if you're watching someone else suffer. Those are two very different situations. And we need to face both. And I believe Christ in his life and death and resurrection, and particularly in the way he lived and approached people, showed us that we can trust God with it.
Well, John, I don't want this to just be an interesting evening. Everybody, oh, that was interesting. And is that as we draw this into a close, if someone has found this interesting, what are you going to suggest they should do to look into the Bible as a next step?
Well, what I would suggest, and I'm going to do a bit of shameless advertising now, but this little book is called The Word 1-to-1. And there is absolutely nothing that is more convincing than being directly confronted with the Word of God if a friend is prepared to read it with you. Sitting down with someone, just one-on-one, with an introduction that opened up some part of Scripture that would resonate with them, was a very effective way. And I would say to the Christians here, if you've never done that before, it's transformational to sit with someone and help introduce them to the person in whom you believe.
So well done, John. Can I suggest we give him a round of applause for just doing it?